In 1940, Germany unleashed a blitzkrieg on an unprepared and unsuspecting Europe. Hitler's tank divisions shocked the world with their overwhelming mobility, armor and firepower as they carved up the continent for the Axis forces. The Allies knew they would have to work against time to develop and produce a tank that would defeat the Third Reich. In 1942, Britain unveiled its new weapon of war, a machine it hoped would save lives and halt the spread of fascist terror, the Churchill tank. By 1916, the First World War was entering its second, terrible, blood-soaked year. Since 1914, the French had endured the heaviest fighting with the Germans at the battles of the Marne and Verdun. The French armies were completely exhausted. For the British, it was time to step up a gear and take on the burden of crushing the German army once and for all. By the 17th of September 1916, the British prepared to unleash a secret weapon that would not only crush the Germans, but staunch the flood of death that was desecrating the ranks of its army. The age of the tank had begun.
The British invented the tank, and by 1917 they were very good at its use. Now initially, when it first comes in 1916, it's very primitive, there aren't enough of them, it's mechanically unreliable, but it's a start, and like all new weapon systems, it takes time for it to come to be really of much use. But by 1917 it was very good. By 1918, only the British have got a workable battle tank as opposed to an upgunned armoured car. And it is the British who have integrated the tank into an all-arms force with the infantry, the artillery, the engineers, and increasingly the air, combining to produce aggression on the battlefield.
Tens of thousands, nobody quite knows how many, infantry soldiers owed their lives to the presence of tanks. The tank completely broke the German army's will to fight. After very small, modest beginnings on the Somme, through to Amiens, where we had over 400 tanks in the line, and we punched an 8-mile hole through the German defences. This attack was described by Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German army. There was no chance that they would win now. They were only facing defeat. And ultimately, Winston Churchill described the tank crews as being the most profit-bearing group of the entire army.
The tank enjoyed a wave of popularity that swept through Britain after its first tour on the battlefields of France. But not everyone in the army shared Churchill's enthusiasm for the tank. Many cavalry commanders thought the tank was nothing more than a very expensive fad.
After the First World War, there were some officers in the British Army who believed that the tank had been almost a freak product of the Western Front during the First World War, and that nothing like that would ever be needed again.
The tank wasn't a war-winning weapon, despite what the newspapers and the PR merchants said. By the end of the war, it's a very useful adjunct to the assets we already have. Not a war-winning weapon, but a very useful bit of kit.
The British did better than other countries in the sense that they preserved their tank corps after the First World War ended. They developed it, they gave it quite a high status in the army.
There was great debate as to what a tank was for. What was the role of the tank? Was it just something to provide intimate fire support for the infantry? If it was, it didn't have to move very fast. 4 miles an hour would be quite good enough because that was as fast as the infantry could move. Was it something that ought to be able to operate independently? The land cruiser, in which case it had to be able to operate rather faster, it had to be able to cross obstacles, it had to have reasonable firepower. Was it just a defensive weapon? Was it an attacking weapon? Or was it just for reconnaissance? And all these debates as to exactly what the tank was for, combined with lack of funding, all really led, I think, to the British going down a bit of a blind alley between the wars.
In 1934, one of the last mechanised exercises ran by the Army was basically, to put it bluntly, fixed by senior officers to make it look as though the infantry and the horse cavalry were still predominant on the battlefield. And from that point onwards, mobile mechanised armoured warfare took a back seat in British military thinking.
The area in which you can say we excelled was in fact in the theoretical use of tanks. The sad thing is that these thoughts were adopted enthusiastically by the German army once Hitler came to power. And I'm afraid we paid sorely for the results of years of political neglect.
I'm not sure that the British had a great deal of knowledge about what the Germans were doing, and I'm not sure the British were terribly interested, although they ought to have been. The Germans knew exactly what we were up to. They frequently visited England, official, formal, properly constituted visits. They came over, they looked at this armoured division, they looked at how it works, they talked to the British who were using it, they learnt a lot from it, they took those lessons back and they applied them to their own development of armoured doctrine.
The tanks produced before the outbreak of the Second World War were a painful reminder of how economic cutbacks had eaten into Britain's defence budget. In 1935, the manufacturer Vickers worked with the government to thrash out a specification for an infantry tank. Vickers argued that it could build a tank for £15,000 or less. This figure was later slashed to a mere £6,000. But would the resulting cut-price tank live up to expectations?
There was nothing. There was a track, there was an engine, there was an armoured hull, and there was an armoured turret mounting a machine gun, and that was it. It looked like a duck, and it got its name from a cartoon duck of the period called Matilda.
What was really wanted was a main battle tank that could do everything, but at the beginning of the war, and for quite some time, that isn't the British concept. So we have a whole series of infantry tanks, and the Matilda really is the one that we start the war with.
The A-11, otherwise known as the Matilda infantry support tank, had a two-man crew. Mounting a .3-inch machine gun, it had armour plating up to 60 millimetres thick. It was 4.85 metres long, 2.28 metres wide, and 1.86 metres high, weighing in at 11,161 kilos.
The Matilda I was a very simple little stopgap vehicle with a two-man crew. It did have some stout armour. It was reasonably reliable. The problem was that it was such a small machine, all it could mount was a machine gun, which was very, very difficult to handle indeed.
It had all the problems of extreme cheapness. It didn't have any kind of real armour-piercing weapon for use against enemy tanks.
The interesting thing about the British is that they were the ones who concentrated upon armour. And that was indeed its principal item of note. The rest of it was extremely mediocre. It was only designed to go at walking pace. It had a Ford car engine, very underpowered, very slow motion suspension, and a very light armament. It was literally a small mobile pillbox.
It has hardly got any punch at all. It is used quite a lot on the counter-attack at Arras in 1940, when in fairness it does put the wind up the Germans. Rommel almost gets killed by one of them. In fact, his ADC is killed. Rommel thinks he's being attacked by 5 brigades. In fact, he's being attacked by 3 regiments.
This counter-attack not only mauled Rommel's division, but scared off the neighbouring SS division. The Matilda caused such alarm in German headquarters that the Panzer Division's drive to the coast was delayed for 24 hours. Crucially, This delay helped to ensure the success of the Dunkirk evacuation.
But really, that was the finest hour of the Matilda. It was never really very much good. It never really carried any punch.
Matilda 2 was an enormous advance on Matilda 1. It had a proper turret with a 2-pound gun in it. Again, even thicker armour. It was relatively mobile at around 12 miles an hour. It was a little faster than walking pace, and it had a reasonable radius of action. The problem with it was that it was much more expensive to produce.
What it couldn't do was fire a high explosive round. So from that perspective, it was actually probably worse at supporting the infantry than the Matilda 1, because all it could do was attack enemy tanks or defend the infantry from marauding enemy tanks. It couldn't provide direct high explosive support to support infantry in the attack, which is what the infantry tanks were supposed to be there for.
There weren't a great many of them, just one regiment of Matildas in 1940, when Wavell started his offensive against the Italians. The Italians found that they hadn't a gun which was capable of penetrating the Matilda at all. In fact, the appearance of a Matilda was often sufficient for their infantry to throw their hands up and say, well, enough's enough. In fact, the Matilda really sealed the fate of the Italian 10th Army, of Sidi Barrani and later at Bardia and then Tobruk. They had nothing which could stand against it. Their own tanks were very, very badly designed, and their anti-tank guns were quite inadequate.
During this campaign, the tank earned itself the title Queen of the Battlefield, a title it retained until the Africa Corps, with its devastating anti-tank guns, reached North Africa the following year.
It enjoyed enormous success in France and in the early desert campaigns, where it was impervious to most standard issue Axis anti-tank guns. The only thing that could destroy it was an 88mm anti-aircraft gun. But it proved to be immensely successful and was very, very popular with the troops.
The Valentine infantry support tank was certainly a step up from its predecessors. It needed a 3-man crew. It mounted a 2-pounder gun, as well as a Beza 7.92mm machine gun. Its armour was up to 65mm thick. It was powered by an AEC engine that was capable of a 90-mile range, 135 brake horsepower, and a road speed of 15 miles per hour.
The War Office initially wasn't very keen on it because it didn't fit into the cruiser tank role very well. It wasn't fast enough for that, they believed. On the other hand, it didn't really fit the infantry tank role either because it wasn't as heavily armoured as they thought infantry tanks really needed to be. So it was a bit of a misfit. But they needed tanks urgently, desperately, in the early stages of the Second World War, and so it was decided to go ahead and produce this vehicle. And it's a good job that they did go ahead with it, because indeed it was one of the better British tanks of the early part of the Second World War.
It got its name because the designs were submitted on St. Valentine's Day, and it used components which had been tried and tested, like the slow-motion suspension on the A9 and 10 cruisers. Also, very good heavy-duty engines. It hardly ever broke down.
The Valentine, at last, we've actually got a British tank which is mechanically reliable. But at the same time, it's still an infantry tank, so it's terribly slow. And initially, it was a terribly expensive way to carry a machine gun. As the war goes on, however, it is upgunned with difficulty, because one of the problems with the Valentine was it had a very small turret. But things do get better, and we actually produce an awful lot of them. About a third of British tank production throughout the war is Valentines.
It was most unusual in a desert environment to find a tank with that record of reliability. One regiment, in fact, travelled all the way from Alamein to Tunisia with the same vehicles, which is almost unique and got the nickname Monty's Foxhounds because of it. Disadvantages were that it was a rather small tank, a 2-man turret, and really it's a 3-man job inside a turret. Other than that, it was a nice little vehicle. You could tuck it into a piece of ground and hardly anybody would know you were there.
Meanwhile, back in the United Kingdom, the 4th Infantry Tank had taken shape. When war broke out in 1939, it was agreed that although trench warfare was a thing of the past, there would be a need for an infantry tank capable of crossing shell-torn ground and other obstacles.
If the Churchill had been produced 25 years earlier, it would have been brilliant, because it was designed for the First World War. It was designed for the Western Front, and people thought the Western Front in the Second War would be, as it was in the First War, a battlefield littered with shell holes, great deep lines of trenches, thick belts of wire, speed not terribly important, but a tank had to have the ability to cross obstacles. Well, unfortunately, of course, for the designers of the Churchill, the Second War wasn't anything like that. The Second War was much more a war of manoeuvre, so many of the qualities the Churchill was intended to have were actually irrelevant.
At that particular time, we had virtually no tanks left in the country. It was important, critically important, to get as many tanks into production as we possibly could. And Vauxhall were told to get it in production and issued to units within a year. Now, they did hit their target, but that left insufficient time for testing and evaluation.
Churchill was an attempt to rectify the mistakes of the past. It had a 5-man crew and mounted 3 guns, a 2-pounder, a Beza 7.92mm machine gun, as well as a 3-inch howitzer. The Churchill's armour was up to 102mm thick. Its Bedford 12-cylinder engine was capable of a 90-mile range, 350 brake horsepower, and a top road speed of 15.5 miles per hour.
In 1940, we desperately needed a tank. Most of the ones we had been left behind at Dunkirk. So the Churchill was rushed into production without being properly tried and tested first, and therefore inevitably there were big mechanical problems to begin with. And it was said that Mr. Churchill was very unhappy about his name being given to something that didn't work terribly well.
The Churchill itself, the original specification was very much of the First World War lozenge-shaped Mark I to Mark V tanks with a very large track surface area, which is why if you look at a photograph of a Churchill, it looks quite old-fashioned, and it looks a bit like a First World War tank, especially with its large track area.
When crews actually started training on the Churchill, they found they were confronted with a complete minefield of technical problems. There were engine problems, there were transmission problems, there were track problems. There was even a problem in wet weather because in their haste the manufacturers had not included internal drainage channels, so you would find water slopping round your feet. But Vauxhall had attached engineering teams to the regiments which were equipped with the Churchill, and they resolved these issues very quickly with a series of modifications. In fact, the handbook says that we know the vehicle isn't perfect, and then lists a whole string of faults. And these were put right very, very quickly, so that by the end of 1941, beginning of 1942, you had a workable tank.
The crews liked the Churchill. It was much less likely to go on fire when it was hit than, for example, the Sherman. One of the main faults of the Sherman was that it brewed up if it was hit. You could escape from a Churchill very much more easily than you could from any other tank because it had 2 hatches on the side. And it was relatively easy to look after. There was quite a lot of room inside a Churchill. It was comfortable.
The Churchill tank visually looked unusual in that the track and the sprockets that the track ran around stuck out from the front of the tank, which made it look like it had got horns on the front, and that's the term that it was colloquially known by. And in many designers' views, that was not really acceptable because it would restrict the vision of the driver, who was set back more into the front of the hull. However, as it was found, tanks generally were so noisy and the vision was so restricted that that little loss of extra vision didn't really make much difference on the battlefield. So overall, it didn't turn out to be too bad.
Inside the tank, if you looked forward into the driving compartment, you'd see the driving position on the right with the usual controls, but instead of two steering levers with which most tanks are equipped, you'd find a tiller bar. Otherwise, the hull gunner lives on the left of the vehicle. You can see his mounting a Beezer machine gun in a ball and his gun sight there. Inside the turret itself, looking forward to the left, you're looking from the commander's position, and you will see the gunner's seat immediately in front of him with its gun controls. You'd also notice, looking at the Churchill, that it seemed an awful lot of hull for a very small turret.
Before the advent of motorways and things like that, most large-scale tank movements had to take place by rail. And because of this, it was felt that a two-man turret would be the best way forward. So you'd only have the tank commander and the gunner in there, and it meant that the tank commander not only was directing where the driver should go, he was directing where, if he could see, where the enemy were to the gunner, who had to lay the gun and fire at the target. And he also had to operate all the radio equipment so he could stay in touch with all the other tanks in his unit. And if he was a commander, he had to talk to a higher command as well. And it was found to be completely impractical in actual battlefield use. The commander just became so overloaded with work tasks that it was either a choice of staying in communication with the other tanks in the unit or firing at the enemy. Pretty early on in the war, it was identified that a three-man turret at a very minimum was needed, and a lot of modification and design work went into upgrading the early model tanks to fit new turrets to them later in the war.
The Churchill entered the war at Dieppe in France on the 19th of August 1942. A raid was mounted to test the defences of a heavily fortified stretch of enemy coastline. The tragic lessons learned would later be applied when the Allies returned to continental Europe.
It's often thought that the Churchill was a great failure at Dieppe, and we're all told that. Yes, Churchill tanks were landed on the beach, but any tank landed on the beach would have had a problem in Dieppe. The problem was that the beach was shingle.
The Canadians played the principal part in this, and it was one of their Churchill regiments, the Calgary Regiment, which came ashore from the landing craft. Now, the going was bad. In many cases, the steel tracks simply couldn't get a grip of the shingle. Little tiny smooth pebbles that skidded about all over the place. The more the tracks turned, the deeper the tanks got.
There was then a sea wall. So what the tank had to do was drive up the beach, get over the sea wall. Now there was a plan to allow tanks to do that. Engineers were going to land, construct wooden ramps, and the tanks would drive up the ramp and into the town. The engineers either got lost or the boats got sunk. They didn't arrive on the beach, or if they did, they didn't arrive with their ramps, and the tanks simply couldn't get off the beach. But that would have applied to any tank of the period. Nobody would have been able to get off the beach, so it wasn't something that was just peculiar to the Churchill.
Really, it was the operation that was compromised. The Churchill's performance, it probably did no better than, or no worse than could have been expected. So, really, as a black mark against the tank, Dieppe doesn't really stand up as a true test of the tank's capabilities.
We couldn't re-embark any of the tanks, so they all fell into enemy hands. When the Germans came down to examine the Churchill, the layout they thought belonged to another war. They even thought that these were obsolete or discarded designs that we had chosen to waste. They couldn't see how the Churchill could fit into their own pattern of armoured warfare, and it didn't. And they said to themselves, there's no point in our trying to develop a tank arm of our own, because clearly it's a mechanical novelty and of no use.
After the costly failure at Dieppe, the Churchills' career seemed over before it had even begun. Instead of replacing the Churchills in service, it was decided to send a number to the North African desert. It was here that the Churchill was forced to rise to the challenge, or face the scrap heap.
The Churchill first saw action in North Africa. Where it really came into its own was not on the plains of Libya, but once we got into Tunisia.
Yes, a limited number of Churchills were used in the desert, primarily in an evaluation unit known as King Force. Its first operation was Alamein, in which they did surprisingly well. It was very important for the Churchill at this stage because the whole project was threatened with cancellation.
The Churchill is incredibly useful, to everybody's surprise, because really it was almost obsolete. And then suddenly we find, here's a tank that can go up terrifically steep slopes. Very useful in Tunisia.
I have come across instances where a squadron commander has actually led his tanks up a slope which nobody thought anybody could climb, and actually got there. He's led them on foot, you know, and it's quite hair-raising. Of course, it doesn't always come off. Sometimes on the slope a tank will crab, go sideways, and once it starts, then there's no stopping it. I have one horrific incident I know where Churchill crabbed on a very steep hillside, turned over 6 times before coming to the bottom, threw its turret off, and of course none of the crew survived. But this was the sort of risk that the Churchill crews took because they had a lot of confidence in their vehicle, and they knew that 9 times out of 10 it wouldn't let them down.
They were all very, very heavily hit by anti-tank weapons of all calibers and types of artillery, and they survived remarkably well. So on the whole, its initial combat experience in the Western Desert was highly encouraging.
It played a very, very significant part in that the Axis defences were located surrounding the Majerda Valley, which was the gateway to Tunis. The very fact that the Churchill could climb these hills and deal with the enemy on them made it extremely significant. Once the first major hill had been taken, the writing was on the wall, and in fact you could measure the time in which it was going to take before the next hill and the one after that, and in fact you could almost predict the date that the Axis surrender would take place. So yes, the Churchill, if you like, was the key in the lock that opened the door, and after that it was a simple case of mopping up.
Despite the Churchill's gravity-defying ability to climb hills, the old problem of cooperation between the infantry and the tank corps remained. As Neville Gilman, a former member of the 7th Armoured Division, remembers, there was little understanding between infantry and tank crews.
We were shelled, but when you're in a tank, I mean, this was artillery, not anti-tank shells. So, although it was a bit uncomfortable, we weren't really bothered. But we felt very sorry for the infantry who were around us, so they were being shelled. But it is very strange how the infantry chaps always used to say to us, "Oh my God, I wouldn't be in those tin cans for all the tea in China, you know." And we used to say, "Oh, well, poor chaps down there, you know, we're relatively safe."
The British took an awful long time to get infantry-tank cooperation working. The tanks didn't really trust the infantry didn't really trust the tanks. They didn't do enough training together. They never really got their act together until actually quite late on in the war. There were other reasons for this as well, one being communications. It was very difficult for an infantryman to actually talk to a tank commander. Not all the radios were compatible and the like. When handheld anti-tank weapons come in, it's a real worry for the tanks.
The technological development that made it possible was the shaped high explosive charge, which essentially sent a jet of flame burning through the armour of a tank, causing chaos and havoc, as you can imagine, within.
An infantryman carrying a Panzerfaust or a Panzerschreck could hide himself pretty much anywhere. And as long as the infantryman was brave enough to stay under cover while the tank got close enough for the range to be effective, these handheld weapons proved quite devastating.
I found a good position in the rut of where the farm carts had gone in and out of a gate, and the ruts were so nice and deep, so I was able to get in the rut. I fired 5 projectiles at the Tiger tank. It was a huge thing, and I was looking straight down the barrel of it, and as I fired the last one, he fired, and it landed on my left, and so I was hit in my all down the left side, from the head down to my shoulder.
There had to be a rethink on infantry tank tactics. So what happened basically from this point onwards was that in open country the tanks would lead the attack as usual. In close country, sort of vineyards, bushes, you know, heavily bushed country, forests, built-up areas, the infantry had to lead, with the tanks following quite closely behind in support.
As the war dragged on and as casualties mounted, it became painfully clear that specialist vehicles were needed to help combat engineers in their dangerous work. This need prompted the arrival of the Churchill Avery.
Once the lessons of the Dieppe raid had been evaluated, we knew the sort of obstacles we had to overcome to break through the coastal defences of what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall. The Churchill hull was very, very suitable for conversion to a variety of engineering tasks because of its size.
Combat engineering is an enormously lethal endeavour, attempting to remove obstacles, bridge obstacles, demolish things, clear minefields under enemy fire. As you can imagine, doing that type of activity, incredibly heavy casualties, and some method had to be found of getting around this. Churchill proved to be an ideal platform. It's good cross-country capability and heavy armour, and quite low profile, which meant that additional equipment wouldn't raise its profile too much.
So the Royal Engineers developed a special turret for it, and it mounted a 290mm mortar which fired a bomb called the Flying Dustbin. And the Flying Dustbin, when it hit a concrete blockhouse or bunker, would simply crack the concrete open. There are other devices that could be used on the Avery, as it was called. It's a box girder bridge which you could lay against a sea wall.
There were fascines, which are huge bundles nowadays of pipes, but in the First World War and the Second World War, they were huge bundles, almost of firewood. These you had to be very, very careful with. They're enormously heavy, so they needed a tank with very strong suspension to carry them. and you dropped them into any kind of obstacle ditch, and you could drive over them. Slight problem with the Churchill when they first started using it was the fact that they put them on the rear of the vehicle and tried to launch them over the back. The problem was the exhaust used to set them on fire, which was quite alarming for the crews. So they were in fact generally carried on the front of the vehicle, although that did foul the main armament.
We were glad of the Churchills because they cleared the minefields with their flails, so we were rather grateful when they came.
What they did was cut down on this terrible human wastage, and they proved enormously successful in Normandy.
One of the most devastating and intimidating Churchill variants was the Churchill Crocodile flamethrower. It reached Normandy after D-Day.
The Crocodile was one of these other derivatives, usually a derivative of a Churchill, sometimes a Cromwell, usually a Churchill, which was in fact a mobile flamethrower. It towed behind it a great big tank of petroleum jelly, and it had a projector on the front, and it fired flame.
The flame gun would blast a jet of flame, well over 100 yards. It stuck to everything it touched. It's a terrible weapon. Quite often, it would work in conjunction with the Avry. So you would find that the Avry would fire its bomb and crack open a blockhouse, and if the occupants didn't come out immediately, a Crocodile would approach within range and flame it. And the result was the flame fuel would drop down the tracks into the interior, and that usually got them out.
Very useful for clearing out bunkers or trench systems. Pretty nasty way to kill people, and in general, if your Crocodile broke down, you legged it, because both sides, totally illegally and quite unofficially, shot people with flamethrowers.
Often the mere appearance of a crocodile was enough for people to put their hands up. Conversely, if a crocodile crew was captured, they could frequently find no mercy being shown to them. I won't say they liked their work. It's been expressed to me by former crocodile crewmen that they considered it inhuman. You can well imagine the result, what it looks like, and once seen, never forgotten. And it really was very unpleasant. But war is unpleasant, and it got results. That's what you're after.
They were a particularly horrific weapon, and certainly Churchill Crocodile crews could expect very short shrift from Germans if they were captured. However, it has to be said that in many occasions, merely the presence of a flamethrower tank was enough to force Germans who might otherwise have held out to surrender immediately. So perhaps it was not quite such an inhumane weapon as might be imagined.
On the 6th of June 1944, the Allies mounted an amphibious invasion of the beaches of Normandy. Their plan was to draw most of the German armour onto the British and Canadian sectors to enable the Americans to break out of the beachhead. To achieve this, Churchill regiments supported a number of heavy infantry raids on enemy-held villages. But the Germans had planned on a bitter fight. Forbidden by Hitler to surrender any ground, the Germans launched furious counterattacks with Tigers, Panthers and Panzer Grenadiers. Allied soldiers were acutely aware of their appalling disadvantage. Not only were they expected to fight in terrain their tanks could barely cope with, but they had to flush out a well-entrenched enemy who had stronger tanks and anti-tank weapons. The situation was bleak.
On level ground, the Churchill couldn't take on the Mark IV, never mind the Mark V Panther or the Mark VI Tiger. It simply wasn't in their league. So you didn't put them up against the Mark IV, the Panther or the Tiger if you could possibly avoid it. You used the Churchill either as its derivatives that we've talked about, flamethrowing tanks and the like, or you used them in hilly areas where they came into their own. but you didn't put them up against Tigers.
The main reason why the Churchill continued in frontline service throughout the war was because of its very thick frontal armour, its survivability on the battlefield. It was the only real Allied tank, including the American tanks, that could even think about standing up to a Panther or a Tiger in a straight-on fight. It probably couldn't knock out the Panther or the Tiger, but it could at least attempt to hold the ground that it had taken while waiting for other supporting elements to come up and help it.
In straight tank versus tank fighting, the Churchill had much thicker armour than anything else the Allies had, but it was still capable of being penetrated at fighting ranges by German 88mm and 75mm rounds. And there was a very famous instance when a section of Churchill's was knocked out in the space of 2 or 3 minutes by 3 or 4 German Jagdpanther tanks armed with 88mm guns. But in many respects, it had better survivability than a lot of other Allied tanks. But it still suffered from the basic problem. It had the 75mm gun at best, which was you could use against an average German tank at quite close ranges. But getting there was difficult. And in fact, in many respects, the Churchill was at a disadvantage here because it didn't have quite that high dash speed that tanks like the Cromwell and perhaps the Sherman had.
All the German tanks, even the Panthers, were very quiet. You didn't hear it until somebody said, "Oh, there's one coming round the corner," you know. They were that quiet, whereas our own Churchills and Shermans kicked up such a hell of a row you could hear them a mile away.
Generally speaking, it was difficult for a Churchill or any number of Churchills to oppose a set of emplaced Tigers. And quite often, I was thinking of some instances in Italy where medium artillery was the only way you could get them to shift at all.
Even when the 6-pounder gun was fitted as it was to some Churchills later on, the armour penetration of that against late German tanks of World War II, such as the Tiger and the Panther, its armour-piercing capability really just wasn't good enough.
They're always fighting at a disadvantage, and the crews was, really very fed up about that. They wished they could hit back on equal terms. In an attempt to put the Churchill on something like a parity with the Panther or the larger, more big up-gun Mark IVs, something, it was decided to build a super Churchill.
The wonderfully named Black Prince was an up-gun Churchill. What they did was they took a Churchill, they re-engineered the turret, and they put a 17-pounder gun in it. Now, a 17-pounder gun was a good anti-tank gun.
Now, in order to do this, the hull had to be widened. An enormous number of other things had to be done to the tank. A number of prototypes were built, but unfortunately Black Prince wasn't in production early enough for the Second World War. In fact, the infantry tank concept really died with it.
Unfortunately, of course, it arrives too late to have much effect on the war. But they are used in the Korean War, where their ability to go up hills, plus the excellent gun, were more than a match for anything the Chinese or the North Koreans could produce.
Although the Black Prince arrived after the surrender of the Axis forces, the Churchill had one more war to fight. In November 1951, a Crocodile squadron landed in Korea. It formed part of the British 29th Infantry Brigade Group.
At that stage, the war was moving quite rapidly from north to south and back again. The idea of flaming fixed fortifications no longer applied in those particular circumstances. So the squadron, except for with one exception, dropped its trailers and fought as conventional Churchill gun tanks, and they helped to break through to a trapped infantry battalion, got most of its companies out, and they also worked with the Americans, who were quite generous in their praise. It worked beautifully on the Korean hills, except in winter. where you'll find steel tracks just wouldn't grip. It's semi-frozen tundra.
From its debut in the blood-soaked fields of the Great War to the barren slopes of North Korea, the infantry support tank has played a crucial role in wars that have altered the world map. After decades of cost-cutting, indecision, and a series of disappointing tanks, the hopes of Britain and its army rested on the Churchill. Despite its shaky start on the beaches of Dieppe, its legendary hill-climbing ability not only saved it from the scrap heap, but helped kick the Axis out of North Africa. The Churchill was the pioneer of the battlefield and deserves its place as one of the finest tanks Britain has ever produced.
The Churchill, although slow and appearing old-fashioned, was a tough battlefield survivor, and for that reason, the reason that it could take so much punishment on the battlefield, it deserved its place as probably the best British design tank of the war.
The Churchill, in a sentence, was immensely strong, had tremendous cross-country capability, but was really a lot of tank for very little gun.
The Churchill was designed and intended for a war that never happened. It had all sorts of things wrong with it to begin with, but its ability to climb hills was the thing that gave it a lease of life. And it's also its ability to be converted to other purposes that kept it in life long after really it should have been.
In the First World War, Britain pioneered the use of an important weapon, the tank. Nothing like it had ever been seen on the battlefield before. In 1918, it helped the British armies in France to crush the Germans. By spring 1940, Germany completely turned the tables on its enemies by unleashing a merciless panzer thrust in France. Not only did this bring the nation to its knees, but it forced the British to flee the continent, leaving its tanks on the beaches at Dunkirk. This episode shows how Britain surmounted technical, tactical, and financial problems to produce a tank that could take on the most formidable weapons in the world. The Cromwell. Between 1914 and 1918, both aircraft and tanks had become important weapons of war. The tank was developed by the British in 1915 and was first used on the 15th of September 1916. Its debut was far from successful, and it was hampered by all kinds of problems.
The British invented the tank, and by 1917 they were very good at its use. Now initially, when it first comes in 1916, it's very primitive, there aren't enough of them, it's mechanically unreliable, but it's a start, and like all new weapon systems, it takes time for it to come to be really of much use. But by 1917 it was very good. By 1918, only the British have got a workable battle tank, as opposed to an upgunned armoured car.
Tanks in the First World War didn't have turrets, as you see on these tanks here. They had sponsons mounted on the side of the hull. This was for two purposes. Firstly, you needed the weapon mounted quite low so you could fire down into trenches as you passed over them. But also, the primary design characteristic of First World War tanks was predicated around their ability to cross trenches and large obstacles. To do this, they needed to have a thing called an unditching beam on the top. It's a large beam of wood that would go into the trench. If it got lodged in the trench, it could lever itself up. And you couldn't have a turret on the top if you were going to have that.
Crews were working often in temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was very hot, very unpleasant. The atmosphere was laden with petrol fumes and carbon monoxide. Mechanical reliability was also a very major problem. In the early versions, the tracks quite often snapped. So there were numerous problems with these things when they were first introduced. And some of these problems were never altogether solved in the whole course of the war.
By the second half of 1917, some British officers were dismissing the tank as an expensive failure. But the Battle of Cambrai on the 20th of November 1917 proved them completely wrong.
The big opportunity to use the tank as the tank designers intended was at Cambrai in 1917, when a large number of tanks broke through the German lines. So without prior artillery bombardment, taking the enemy by surprise, using good ground rather than the very poor ground, and a large breakthrough happened. It was here that the inherent problem of the tank came through, that it wasn't fast enough, and the attack collapsed, though it showed the promise of the tank.
The tank's performance at Cambrai showed that when deployed in large numbers on suitable ground and with the benefit of surprise, they could be used effectively. Not only did the performance of the British tanks show what could be achieved, but it was enough to boost the flagging confidence of the infantry and of British High Command. Tanks did not win the First World War for the Allies, yet the improved tanks available in the second half of 1918 made a significant contribution to victory. Victories that forced the Germans to sign the humiliating armistice of the 11th of November 1918.
I think the difficulty was that it was seen by the public as being much more than it actually was. It was seen by the public as being a war-winning weapon. It was seen by many of the politicians as being a war-winning weapon. Now, the army knew it wasn't. It was a very useful adjunct to the infantry and the artillery. It was something that could cross obstacles. It was something that could create gaps in German wire. It was something that could give intimate fire support to the infantry. But it was never going to be a war-winning weapon.
Were they an infantry support weapon? Were they a replacement for the cavalry? Did we want big tanks? Did we want little tanks? Big tanks would be expensive to build and we could only have a few of them. Small tanks would be limited in capability. Yes, there was an enormous debate. And what was the tank supposed to do? Was it supposed to fight other tanks? Was it supposed to fight infantry? Was it in fact supposed to be a strategic weapon that disappeared way beyond the enemy's lines and really in fact almost by its very presence caused the enemy to collapse, to withdraw?
Most of the lessons, ironically, were learnt by the Germans, who didn't invent the tank, who only made one tank of their own, which was a complete failure. But the lesson they took was that although armour wasn't a war-winning weapon now, it might be in the future. Now, if you're a German, you have to win a war very quickly. And if you don't win it at all. And that's a factor of where Germany is geographically. Now, the German soldiers saw that something like the tank might enable them to win battles very quickly. What they didn't want to do was ever again get bogged down into a battle or a war of attrition, which inevitably they would lose.
Until the early 1930s, the British were the world leaders in the development of tanks and in military ideas about their use. During the 1930s, however, this lead slipped away as other countries devoted far more money and industrial capacity to tank development. As a result, Britain was far from prepared when Germany unleashed its blitzkrieg on France in 1940. The outcome was devastating.
Blitzkrieg rolls through France. Actually, the British and the French between them had more tanks than the Germans, and in most cases they had better tanks. The difference was that the Germans knew how to use them and the British didn't.
The development of British armoured forces and technical development of British tanks goes badly wrong in the early 30s. One of the reasons for this, the simplest reason, is that there's a massive government financial cut in 1931. These fall particularly heavily on the army. The Great Depression has a rather different impact on Germany, because what it does in Germany, of course, is to bring Adolf Hitler to power in 1933. And what then happens is that the German government gives absolutely massive priority to its army.
The Germans had carried out a secret tank development program in conjunction with the Russians, strangely enough, in the Soviet Union. And that was secret, and not much was known about that outside Germany and the Soviet Union. But post Hitler coming to power, he was keen to show the rise of the German armed forces and was very keen to show off what he was developing and how good his tanks, his panzers were going to be.
Britain's armoured division, made up mostly of light and infantry tanks, was annihilated before France finally fell in 1940. Although most of the men escaped, every tank was abandoned. The years of indecision and thrift that had blighted British tank development came back to haunt the War Office. Faced with the overwhelming power and flexibility of the German panzer divisions, Britain's military strategists were forced to rethink tank doctrine, training, and equipment. It was a rude awakening.
Enormous number of rumours came out of this, the sort of the mythical invincibility of German tanks, when they were in fact quite the reverse and not at all as good as British and French tanks. It's interesting that the Russians too got taken in by a lot of German propaganda, and this is what started the race to increase tank gun calibre throughout the war. In fact, the British never really caught up with.
The Germans knew exactly what we were up to. They frequently visited England, official, formal, properly constituted visits. They came over, they looked at this armoured division, they looked at how it works, they talked to the British who were using it, they learnt a lot from it, they took those lessons back and they applied them to their own development of armoured doctrine, which, as I say, they were carrying out largely in Russia.
The Germans were sort of actually behind the Russians, and but they were well ahead of us by the time we came to meet them in force.
By the early 1940s, tanks were being ordered straight from the drawing board into mass production. With no time for testing, cruisers were put through their paces on the battlefield, often with disastrous results. At the start of the war, there were more casualties as a result of breakdowns than of enemy fire. The several years it took to get from design to manufacture also meant that British tanks entered the battlefield much later than they were really needed. This time lag meant that models emerging at the start of the war were always one step behind their German counterparts.
I think there was a confusion inside the army as to what exactly was required for any future mechanised warfare. And in the end, the British took the view that they needed a bit of everything, so there was an attempt was made to design a range of tanks which would do individual jobs on the battlefield, rather than attempt to produce one type of tank that could do everything effectively.
The British were really trying to develop two distinct types of tank. Light tanks, which were mainly for reconnaissance purposes, and medium tanks, which were supposed to do really all the different kinds of fighting.
I think the British were logical about what they were doing. What the British didn't do was, when it became apparent very early in the war that this wasn't working, they didn't quickly adjust what they were trying to do and change their design and production, the way they went about producing tanks. So it's an inability to adjust to changing situations during the very early part of the war, I think, that was a problem.
The Crusader served the British forces in the North Africa campaign until the arrival of the American Grant tanks. But at the end of a very long chain of cruiser development throughout the war, emerged a tank that not only earned respect and affection among British tank crews, but propelled British tank technology to the world's Premier League: the Cromwell. Manned by a crew of 6, the A9 started life as a medium tank, a classification that was changed to that of cruiser. The A9 mounted a 2-pounder gun, 3 7.65mm machine guns and a 3-inch howitzer. Its AEC engine was capable of a range of 150 miles, 150 brake horsepower and a top road speed of 25 miles per hour. Although early testing proved the tank to be overweight with a tendency to come off its tracks, Vickers worked on it for another year, and by 1939 models were being delivered to France, Egypt and Greece. But the supply problems that had dogged the A9's development were far from over. Models were being issued without their 2-pounder guns, while those with guns were not supplied with ammunition. There were no spare parts, no tools, and few soldiers were trained to operate or maintain them.
The A9 had a very confused origin. It was originally designed for a requirement in 1934 for an infantry tank, a tank to support infantry. And in many ways, this is why it had the 2 rather unwieldy machine gun turrets and the very large crew that it had. It was actually used as a cruiser. By the time we had defined what we wanted to do with tanks, we had decided that it was too large, too expensive, and a little bit too mobile for use as an infantry tank.
The A9 had a very reliable suspension, and it was armed with a 2-pounder gun. It was reasonably adequate for the campaigns it fought in.
It had a few limitations as a cruiser tank. The suspension was not designed for high speeds. It was a very good system, but it was a low-speed system. It wasn't sufficiently powerful.
The armour on the A9 was really very thin. I think there were teething troubles too with mechanical reliability to begin with.
It couldn't fire a high explosive shell, so if it found itself on the battlefield in a situation where it was faced with an enemy that was anything other than an enemy tank, it couldn't really do anything. So it was not very good against enemy anti-tank positions, for example.
But again, we don't really know how to use them. Even if it had as good a gun as the German tanks, even if it was as reliable, until we, the British, learn how to use our tanks, how to integrate them with anti-tank guns, with infantry, with artillery, we're never going to get anywhere.
At the same time as the A9 was undergoing development, the War Office started to look forward to the next generation of cruiser tanks. So in 1936, the British War Office sent officers on a fact-finding mission to the Soviet Union. Their discoveries revolutionized British tank design. What impressed them most was the outstanding off-road performance of the Russian BT tanks that incorporated a suspension system designed by the American inventor J. Walter Christie. The US War Office had rejected Christie's designs, and it was only as the war progressed that his concept became recognized as one of the biggest innovations in tank design. By 1936, not only were Russian tanks capable of hitting 40 miles per hour, but they were infinitely more reliable, and as a result, most remained in service. After this report, the British War Office commissioned the Nuffield Mechanisation Company, the tank-building arm of the Morris Group, to begin work on a fast cruiser tank based on the Christie suspension system. By December 1938, the first models of the A-15 cruiser tank were leaving the production line. The A-15 evolved to replace the aging 1930s A-9 as the British Army's main cruiser tank. The A-15, otherwise known as the Crusader, had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 2-pounder gun and 2 7.92mm Beezer machine guns. The Crusader's armour was up to 40mm thick. Its Nuffield Liberty engine was capable of a range of 100 miles, a brake horsepower of 340, and a top road speed of 27 miles per hour.
The Crusader, I believe, was probably the most handsome tank ever produced. The amount of speed that it could produce was quite phenomenal. The anti-tank gunners and the mortar crews alike found it very difficult to range on it because it did move very quickly. You'd no sooner get your sight set on a particular point than it was off, and they didn't like it.
In terms of its gun armour combination, the 2-pounder or 40mm gun which it has, in terms of its armour piercing capability, is really quite good for 1941. By the time you get into 1942, the situation's beginning to change, and the penetrative power of the 2-pounder gun is possibly inadequate by that period. And also you've got a problem that the 2-pounder gun doesn't fire high explosive, which you need for some purposes.
The problem with the Crusader in the Western Desert is partly mechanically unreliable initially, and it takes a long time to get that sorted out. Initially we lose more tanks to mechanical breakdown than we do to the enemy. The other problem was the gun. The 2-pounder just wasn't powerful enough to be of any use against even the German Mark III. Mark IV would bounce off. Once the Germans start bringing in Panthers and even Tigers, and they do bring 25 Tigers over to North Africa in the latter stages, well, the poor old Crusader just doesn't have a hope.
The Crusader made its debut in 1941, when the campaign in the North African desert was reaching a critical phase. In September 1940, the Italian forces had steamrollered into Egypt. From December 1940, the British, Indian and Australian forces had doggedly pursued the Italian army. Their 2-pounder guns were suited to this task, and by February 1941, most Italian tanks had been knocked out. Neville Gilman was a tank commander with the 7th Armoured Division, otherwise known as the Desert Rats.
We arrived in Egypt at the end of August 1941. Italy had come into the war, you see, and Libya was an Italian colony. So the British troops had invaded Libya. They had really beaten the Italian army, and they went right back beyond Benghazi, by which time the British lines of communication were very stretched.
With us, we had our tanks, which were Crusader tanks. The tanks were delivered by rail to us at Amrir, as the place was called. And then, in early November, we started to move westwards up to what we called the wire, which was the barbed wire fence which ran down the frontier between Egypt and Libya. And we had our first engagement on the 19th of November, when we encountered what appeared to be a formation of, we thought, Italian transport.
Intelligence reports had been that it was Italian lorries. In fact, the lorries were hiding anti-tank guns, and the regiment went in and made a great charge, and there was very heavy casualties.
Allied tank crews were starting to put the disaster at Dunkirk down to bad luck and lack of preparation. The German answer to the Italian debacle was defiant. They sent over their tank ace, Rommel, who promptly and brilliantly drove the Allied army back to the Libyan-Egyptian border. It was a shock for the Allies. There was another crucial reason why the Germans were enjoying success. Not only were their tanks protected with thicker armour and mounted with long-barreled 50mm guns, but they had also found a new devastating use for their anti-aircraft gun, simply known as the 88.
I'm sure we were hit by a German 88mm gun, which were the ones we were all terrified of, because they were converted anti-aircraft guns. And if they hit them, they just blew the tanks to pieces. I mean, they're enormous things, colossal muzzle velocity and whatnot. And the Germans, being very thorough and efficient people, they decided to convert anti-aircraft and turn them into anti-tank guns, which they used to enormous effect.
One always hoped, and the vast majority of cases, you did bail out. I bailed out 3 times and got away with it. We had a sergeant who bailed out of 15 tanks and got away with it. The unlucky ones were the ones who were wounded and couldn't get out when the tank burned. That was the worst scenario of all. And of course you always had this at the back of your mind.
The problem for the Allies was not the speed with which their own tanks were being rushed into service, or the show of steel displayed by the Axis forces. The Germans simply knew how to use their tanks, to devastating effect.
The real German superiority, I think, is in the way they use their armour. The Germans were usually much better at concentrating their tanks on the battlefield. The British had a depressing tendency in 1941, early 42, to dissipate their armour all over the battlefield. You could almost say all over the theatre of operations. And this really wasn't any good when it came to dealing with German armour, which was much more concentrated.
We really thought that our tanks were absolutely the last word. We'd been sold on the idea that the Nuffield cruisers, the Crusaders, we knew they were extremely fast. They'd do 40 miles an hour on flat desert. We knew that the gun was small, because the gun was minute, a 2-pounder gun, about 37mm caliber.
We kept on telling them in the desert that our tanks were puny little things armed with toy shotguns. We went out armed with something called a 2-pounder, which was a pathetic thing about that long. And when I fired first at a German tank, it went 500 yards and dropped in the sand. No question of hitting a tank. And if it hit the tank, it wouldn't have hurt it.
We watched our shells from our 2-pounder guns bounce off the front of German Mark III and IVs at 500 yards. They were using an extremely powerful 50mm gun on the Mark III, and the Mark IV had a 75mm gun, which would just come straight through the armour of a Crusader, even the frontal armour.
By the summer of 1940, it was painfully obvious that Britain needed a cruiser tank with a heavier armour and a bigger gun than the Crusader. As a short-term measure, the 6-pounder gun was fitted onto a modified Crusader, but this meant removing a member of the turret crew, when it was common knowledge that using a turret was a 3-man job. So in November 1940, the Department of Tank Design issued its specification for the new generation of tanks.
The Liberty had absolutely had it by the time, by the Middle War years. It was an engine that dated back to 1916. It was really well past its prime. The Meteor, on the other hand, was a derated Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with a supercharger taken off, a different transmission. But that was an engine that had been rated for 1,200 horsepower. It was well proved. It was a wonderfully reliable engine. And it did prove to be a fantastic tank engine. It was used in British tanks up until the late 1960s.
One of the problems of British tank design during this period, and funnily enough, it's a problem that reoccurs in the 70s and the 80s of British tank design, is we tend to underpower our tanks. Now, with the arrival of the Meteor, we're starting to iron that out. The Meteor engine was a derivative of the engine being used in the Spitfire, which was a very reliable engine. It was an engine which was actually, although more technical than what had gone before, was in a funny way, it was easier to maintain and certainly more reliable. So we're beginning to get an engine that's going to work.
The cruiser Mark VII, better known as the Cavalier, had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 6-pounder gun with 2 Beezer machine guns. Its armour was up to 76 millimeters thick. Its Nuffield Liberty engine gave it a range of 165 miles, 410 brake horsepower, and a top road speed of 24 miles per hour. The Cavalier was never used in battle as a gun tank, as faster and more reliable Cromwells had become available by 1944. But it did see service as an observational tank and was used in this capacity by the Royal Artillery in northwest Europe.
The Cavalier was a natural attempt to improve upon the Crusader. It was meant to be better armoured and contained the potential for mounting a larger gun. The problem really was that you're still using the Liberty engine. And if you're up armouring and you've changed the whole design to a slightly larger one, then you're giving the engine several more tons weight to cope with.
By mid-1943, British General Staff had changed its policy on tank armaments. Experience in North Africa told that following a breakthrough, the real targets were anti-tank guns and dug-in infantry. So rather than the usual armour-piercing gun, what was really needed was a tank that could fire a decent high-explosive shell against these softer targets. Not only were the subsequent Cromwell Marks fitted with this new lethal 75mm gun, but the existing Cromwells in service were withdrawn and their 6-pounder guns replaced. Developed from the 6-pounder and incorporating some of its components, the 75mm gun used American and French rounds, meaning that tank crews could rely on a consistent ammunition supply. The second heavy cruiser tank to succeed the Crusader was, like its predecessor, called the Cromwell II. This name was changed to the Centaur.
Centaur's main difference from the other Cromwell variants was simply the Liberty engine. It was quite as simple as that. It was originally intended to have the Meteor, but unfortunately Meteor production didn't keep up with tank production. But it was entirely interchangeable. It was designed to be interchangeable, and it had the advantage over the Cavalier that it had the efficient cooling system.
It did serve in the Royal Marines support group on D-Day. They did advance inland quite a long way, acting as supplementary artillery.
The Centaur had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 6-pounder gun with either 1 or 2 Beezer machine guns. Its armour was up to 76mm thick. Its Nuffield Liberty engine was capable of a 160-mile range, a brake horsepower of 395, and a top road speed of 27 miles per hour. Had Britain finally developed a tank that could realistically take on the German Panzer Division? She had, but not in nearly sufficient numbers to have a chance of threatening the might of the German armoured force. So in May 1943, production of the Cromwell was transferred to Leyland Motors. The heavy cruiser A27M, otherwise known as the Cromwell, needed a 5-man crew. It mounted a 6-pounder gun, 3 7.92mm Beezer machine guns, and another 75mm gun. Its armour was up to 76mm thick. Its Rolls-Royce Meteor engine was capable of a range of 173 miles, an impressive 600 brake horsepower, and a top road speed of 40 miles per hour.
When Cromwell was originally designed, it was intended to fight German tanks of the nature of the German Panzer IV with the short 75mm gun, or the later Panzer III variants with the long-barreled 50mm gun. And these type of tanks it was perfectly capable of taking on.
Now, unfortunately, it really came in about 2 years too late. And by the time it is in general issue, it's not a match for the Panther, and certainly not a match for the Tiger. But what it has got is speed. Now, that is why when we land in Normandy, the reconnaissance regiments, which need to be able to move quite quickly, are armed with the Cromwell. Army tank brigades are armed with the Cromwell. Another good characteristic it's got is it's very good at going up hills. And when we get further into Normandy, of course there are hills. And the Cromwell was rather better going up a hill than the Sherman, although the Sherman was a much more modern tank.
On paper, the Cromwell seemed to answer the prayers of the hard-pressed British tank crews. But would it pass muster with the men in the field?
There are descriptions of Cromwell crews being briefed immediately before Normandy as they came home from North Africa, 7th Armoured Division, and were equipped with the new Cromwells. They had a lot of hope that they were finally going to get something very good. When they were briefed by their commanding officer on the strengths of German tanks, it was apparently a very, very sobering experience.
We sent complaints back to the War Office, and our generals certainly did. One or two resigned on the strength of it. But we didn't get a good tank until the war ended. A bit late.
They put the ramp down, and we came down off of the landing craft. And of course, there was bodies everywhere on the beach. And I remember the driver, we were all on intercom, he said, "Good God, Corp, where do I go?" I said, "You've got to go straight on." I said, "But do your best." Now, what's worried me ever since was there somebody there live, just lying wounded? Because you had no option. You just had to go straight to where you had to go, and if there was something in the way, there was something in the way. And you can imagine when you got out later on and looked at your tracks. That was my first initiation.
The Cromwell first saw action in the Battle of Normandy. Following the D-Day landings on the 6th of June, the 7th Armoured Division headed for the Calvados region, just south of the Seine Basin. The terrain could not have been more different to the desert. The area to the south and east of Caen consisted of open, rolling countryside, whereas the landscape to the south and west of Bayeux was a maze of small, sloped fields, boxed in with high, banked, thick hedgerows. Villages were connected by a network of narrow country lanes. For a tank that relied on speed and maneuverability, the Normandy campaign now presented a grim prospect for the Allied tank crews. This seemingly idyllic setting could not have been worse for the Cromwells.
We drove right up the middle, flat out, and then paused for a night and went on in the morning and got to this little town of villas. And our leading squadron had to take a high hill up the far end of it, which was frankly indefensible. I've seen it since. There was no cover, no woodland, no bushes, no scrub. And then the trouble started.
An entire British armoured division is brought to a halt and forced to withdraw by one understrength company commanded by a lieutenant. Even the stupidest, most newly joined second lieutenant does not send a column of armour up a single road onto a high ridge with trees either side. You are asking for trouble. Tanks are useless in close country. They can't see, they can't manoeuvre. What the commanding officer of the Command of Landing Yeomanry should have done was to dismount his infantry at the bottom of the ridge, clear either side of the road and then sent up his armour. Had he done that, they would have found Lieutenant Whitman and his Tiger tanks hiding there, rubbing their hands metaphorically and thinking that all their birthdays had come at once, which of course it had.
I'd pulled back into somebody's farmyard, and then I suddenly saw a bloody great German Tiger tank passing slowly across in front of me. But I'd let my gunner get out to spend a penny, so he couldn't have shot, and I wouldn't have helped if I had. So I put my wireless operator in the gunner's place, got him to load the gun, and decided to chase the Tiger, because the only way to get him with our feeble tanks was to hit him in the rear. So I said to the driver down the intercom, "Follow that tank," and he did. Trouble was, we followed him a bit down this main street, and the bloody man had met one of our other tanks down the other end of the street and had turned round. So we met each other facing at about 400 yards, which was for me murder. So I got in 2 shots because I knew he was there, but they just bounced off the front of his tank. He then had a shot and it didn't bounce off.
And when you got hit, you had exactly 12 seconds to get out the turret, because until you got out, the driver could get out front, but those in the turret couldn't get out until you did. And so you used to put your foot on the top like that and just throw yourself out and roll and hope that you were only going to hit the ground.
My gunner was killed. The other man in front was killed jumping out. Driver got out, he was safe, and I was blown out the top, and I'd been wounded in the face, I didn't know it. And so I ran across the street. I grabbed the wireless, and I was able to tell the rest of the regiment what was going on.
An entire British armoured division is brought to a halt and forced to withdraw by one understrength company commanded by a lieutenant. Both British brigadiers were sacked. The divisional commander, Bobby Erskine, is sacked shortly afterwards, and eventually, during Operation Bluecoat, the corps commander, Bucknell, is sacked, which is not bad if you're a lieutenant.
Although the Cromwells were helped by their close support 95mm howitzer counterparts, they relied on speed to get out of trouble. A 17-pounder gun was developed, which it was assumed would solve all of the Cromwell's problems.
There was a problem fitting the 17-pounder gun into British tanks. The very big, heavy weapon, and the turrets of earlier British tanks were not really designed to cope with it. It was difficult to, in fact, it turned out to be impossible to fit an adequate turret on the Cromwell tank.
Attempts to up-gun the Cromwell to carry a 17-pounder failed miserably, and by late 1943 there was an acute need for a fast cruiser with decent protection and a gun capable of taking out the later German tanks. The first priority for this task was finding and deciding upon a suitable gun that could be mounted onto a Cromwell easily and quickly. This new tank would be built using as many Cromwell components as possible. Eventually, Vickers-Armstrong came up with a design for a lighter and more compact version of the 17-pounder.
Most people regard the Comet as being a bit of a failure. I'm not sure it was. The Comet was never really given a chance. It comes in right at the end of the war. It never really sees very much action. It's then in issue with some units after the war, and it ends up being used as a tank target on a range because it's got quite a lot of armour. So it's a tank that was never really given a chance.
It took a while to get the Comet going, principally because British production efforts were aimed at D-Day. They were aimed at getting a maximum number of tanks into service, re-equipping all the units by the spring, early summer of 1944. So in many respects, anything that was going to come in either at the wrong moment in timing had to be held back slightly to ensure the success of the D-Day landings. So Comet didn't really come into service until the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945. It proved to be a very, very successful tank, but was a little bit too late to have a major impact on the Second World War.
Although the Comet was only rarely intended to be an upgunned Cromwell, by early 1944 it became clear that over half of the tank would have to be redesigned. This finding was a setback. The Comet didn't reach units until Christmas 1944.
The Comet was a redesigned Cromwell, larger hull, similar suspension, larger turret, mounting the 77mm gun, which is a version of the 17-pounder gun. This, in fact, placed it on a parity with the German Panther, and probably slightly above parity with the Panzer, long-barreled Panzer IVs. In January and across 1945, the campaign leading up to the Rhine Cross, and beyond the Rhine, the Comet really tore away into the distance, and there wasn't an awful lot left to stop it, to be fair. It soldiered on until well into the 50s.
By 1945, Britain had finally produced a tank that propelled it to the cutting edge of cruiser design. After more than a decade of cutbacks and indecision that had blighted tank development since its heyday in the 1920s, Britain eventually produced a cruiser that earned respect.
The Cromwell was an adequate battle tank in all departments, but was not outstanding in any, and it really appeared too late in the war to have a significant effect on its outcome.
Its main weakness was the gun. In all other respects, it was quite a good tank. The armour could have been a bit thicker, but it was a good average for its day. When you look at the Comet was a very good tank. And had we had the Comet slightly earlier, perhaps things might have been a bit different.
A high proportion of the British tanks knocked out in the closing stages of the Second World War, 1944, 1945, were not knocked out by German tanks. They were knocked out by anti-tank guns. However, that was no comfort if you happened to run into a German Tiger tank when you were in something like a Cromwell or a Sherman. The Tiger tank definitely, in terms of its gun armour combination, had a major advantage over you.
Had it come in 2 years previously, then it might have made a real difference. As it was, by the time it does come in, the Germans have moved on several steps. That said, it is reliable, it's very good at going up hills, it's fast, and it was really its speed that kept it out of trouble, rather than its protection or its gun.
When the Third Reich toppled Europe in 1940, the United States emerged from its isolation and prepared for war. From having a few hundred tanks in 1939, America's vast car industry became a tank production line overnight. When the US joined the Allies in 1941, it brought a tank that went on to become one of the most prolific and successful of the war. Known as the Lee by the Americans and the Grant by the British. It was America's answer. For some years after the First World War, the men leading the US Army firmly believed that the tank's only purpose was to support the infantry. This strong belief eventually became the 1920 National Defense Act, under which the existing tank corps was split up and placed under the command of the Chief of Infantry. At the same time, the cavalry started a program of mechanization, and to avoid opposing the act, it was forced to refer to the tanks it bought as combat cars.
Any piece of equipment develops according to experience. And the experience that the Americans took back from the First World War was that tanks were purely for supporting infantry. So all their efforts and all their thinking go into the tank as an infantry support weapon. They carry that to its, I suppose, logical, although I prefer to say illogical conclusion, in that they disband the tank corps altogether.
Well, that was part of a broader American military tradition of, raising armies to fight in wartime and then having them demobilise very rapidly at the end of the war. And you would see that at the end of the American Civil War, and precisely the same thing happens at the end of the Great War.
The Americans could not envisage taking part in another major European war. They could only envisage perhaps a border war with Mexico or some kind of warfare in the Pacific, in the Philippines. So really all they wanted were infantry support vehicles.
But even in the 30s, they are still thinking in terms of the tank as an infantry support weapon and not as anything else.
Many middle-ranking army officers, including George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower, believed that the tank had other uses besides supporting the infantry. But their ideas were far too radical for the US Army, so Patton and Eisenhower had to keep their views to themselves or risk damaging their careers.
At that particular time, there was a theory taken quite seriously by the Russians and the French, and especially the Italians, that an infantry tank assault would be led by medium tanks in the first wave, and the second wave would consist of a swarm, if you like, of light tanks. And the United States Army tended to concentrate on this.
The Secretary of War in 1927 goes to actually visit the United Kingdom and sees some of the early British tank manoeuvres and comes back and says, gosh, we ought to do something. And people like Sereno Brett and of course also Douglas MacArthur are well aware of the kind of limitations of the American military. MacArthur becomes Chief of Staff in 1931 and serves until 1936. But again, he's very much constrained by the kind of budgetary constraints that America's under. And remember, this is also the Depression. There's lots of pressure on public expenditure, and the army, and within that armour, is very much near the bottom of the pile.
As America wrestled with the Great Depression during the 1920s and 30s, defense spending was drastically reduced. Although exercises were held to look at the tactical effects of mechanization, the troops involved were dispersed afterwards. By 1940, the US had fewer than 400 tanks, the majority of which were light tanks left over from the First World War.
And the reason that most American tanks were very light was so that they could be carried by American railways and so they could get across all American bridges. And if they took it abroad, so to get across American engineer bridging equipment, which could carry about 15 tons.
This started to change with the Spanish Civil War. The Americans examined the Spanish Civil War and began to realise that the light tanks that they'd concentrated on and were really machine gun armed and not really suitable for modern warfare. So they began to think about a gun armed tank. They still had to have a weight limit, they still had to have a fairly small tank, but a gun armed tank nonetheless. And these started to emerge in the late 1930s.
But in 1940, events forced the US Army to completely change its tank policy. The German blitzkrieg against Poland and France showed the world that tanks were not only lethal in an infantry support role, but could stun opposing forces into submission when used in formation.
1940 is a real sea change for the Americans because nobody had expected France to fall in a matter of 6 weeks. France was regarded as being one of the great powers, and for France to fall so rapidly to the Germans was really an astonishing victory, and the Americans were deeply shocked by that. It preempted a whole raft of measures, including a big increase in the defence budget, a mobilisation of reserves, and a kind of sense of national concern that America may not get involved in this war in Europe, but America needed to be prepared.
In reaction to this turn of events, the M2 tank was put into immediate production. The chassis, engine and suspension of the M2 provided the basis for the M3 and M4 tanks that followed. The M2 had a 6-man crew. It mounted a 37mm M6 gun as well as 8 Browning machine guns. Its armour was up to 32mm thick. Its Wright supercharged engine could reach a range of 130 miles, a brake horsepower of 400 and a top road speed of 26 miles per hour.
It was a reliable machine, bristled with machine guns, some of which pointed backwards, a very dangerous practice, but nevertheless. And it ran on a very robust suspension, had a very big hull. It was suitable for mass production. In fact, it didn't go into mass production because after the German invasion of Poland and later France, it was clearly outclassed.
The M2 was important in that it was a very useful stopgap for training, and that's all it was for. It never got as far as the battlefield. It was undergunned, it was under-armoured, but at least it got people thinking along the right lines, and at least it allowed them to train with some sort of armour.
By 1940, it was obvious that American tanks would need a 75mm gun in a traversing turret to even stand a chance of taking on the Panzers III and IV. Although a tank was being developed that would solve this problem, it would be some time before it was ready for mass production. So the US Army had little choice but to produce a tank based on the M2. Because it was impossible to mount a 75mm gun in the M2's small top turret, the turret was moved to a position over the left sponson and a commander's cupola was added. The right sponson was then enlarged to accommodate a 75mm gun with limited traverse. Named after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, the M3 had a 7-man crew. In addition to its 75mm gun, the M3 also mounted a 37mm gun as well as 4 machine guns. Its armour was up to 37mm thick. Its right radial engine gave it a 340 brake horsepower, a range of 120 miles, and a top road speed of 26 miles per hour.
In many respects, the Lee tank came into being to make use of existing facilities and to make use of existing components. It was an adaptation of the M2. It used the automotive components of the M2, and in many ways it was restricted by the design of the M2. It would have proven far too difficult to design the large turret and large turret ring to fit the 75mm gun in, and they needed the tanks quite urgently. So a compromise design was made using parts of the M2 and having the offset sponson with the 75mm gun in and still retaining the 37mm gun in the turret. A very compromised design that was very manpower intensive, but it was the best that could be done at the time.
But it wasn't long before the Lee changed once again. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster at Dunkirk, Britain was desperately short of tanks. The British Tank Commission was keen to buy large numbers of the Lee, but only on the condition that the design was altered to suit British tank crew practice.
Ideally, the British would have liked the Americans to build a brand new tank to British specifications. That wasn't possible, there just wasn't the time. So the British persuaded the Americans to adapt the Lee into something called the Grant. It's the same tank, but the Grant is the Lee built to certain British requirements.
There were a few subtle differences between the Lee and the Grant. The Lee had a 7-man crew, whereas the Grant had a 6-man crew. Instead of the Lee's Browning machine gun in the commander's cupola, the Grant had a turret-mounted smoke discharger instead.
This is a tank which is well received generally by its crews, and I think particularly in the Western Desert when it arrived. I mean, under Lend-Lease, we have a lot of tanks which are sent out to support the British in the Western Desert. And it's definitely a tank which is well received by its crews, because the tanks up to that point they'd had in the Western Desert, many of them had been, either undergunned, initially, mounting something like a 2-pounder weapon, which was totally ineffective really against the Germans, or they had tanks that were quite good but were prone to mechanical failures and breakdown.
It was roomy. You could stow a great deal inside a Lee or a Grant. It was rather a noisy vehicle in some ways. The suspension squeaked a lot. You couldn't have a silent move towards your objective. Noise gave you away from miles away. It was hot, of course. When both guns were in action, the interior tended to fog up, and at the first possible opportunity you had to open one of the sponson doors and throw out all the empty cases, otherwise the air just wasn't breathable.
And you've got this enormously tall tank, which is very, very difficult to conceal in desert conditions. And also with the main gun load down, it's not as if you can fight hull down with the turret just protruding above the crest of the hill. You actually have to go right up and have the whole hull exposed. So it made a very, very big target. And also with the big crew all clambering over each other inside, again this caused problems. But it did have the 75mm gun, which was absolutely crucial.
The North African campaign begins with the Italians invading from their colony of Libya into British Egypt. They then get a very bloody nose. The British trace them all the way back to Benghazi. At that point, the Germans get worried. They cannot allow their only major ally to be defeated completely in North Africa, so they reinforce. So the battle goes backwards and forwards. And in each case, the person doing the chasing essentially goes too far, runs out of petrol, runs out of track mileage, runs out of rations, and then gets pushed back again in turn.
Rommel was advancing right up towards the Egyptian border, and really we were not faring terribly well in armoured combat. The German 88mm gun was still dominating the battlefield, and this was causing enormous problems. And the principal problem was the fact that these guns could not be engaged with the British 2-pounder and 6-pounder anti-tank guns, which simply didn't fire a high explosive shell that could deal with an in-placed anti-tank gun. And really something had to be done, and had to be done quite urgently.
The Grant's baptism of fire took place on the 27th of May 1942. Besides a number of Matilda infantry support vehicles, British forces had 167 Grants.
The whole thing with the Lee and the Grant, we were actually able to denude US home-based tank units and fetch those tanks over. And so yes, we were building quite a large stockpile of tanks immediately before El Alamein.
The Grant Lee tank was something which was very much seen as a good tank. It could travel at 26 miles per hour. It had a gun which could match the Panzer Mark III. Its construction, using that rivet construction, made it also a tank which could be easy to produce. And so I think it was a very reliable tank, and certainly when it went to the Western Desert, after the mechanical problems they'd had with the Crusader tank and with some of the other cruiser tanks. And so it was regarded initially as a very effective tank, and it did serve very well in the early part of the war.
The British 8th Army occupied a line of defensive boxes linked by minefields running south from Gazala on the Mediterranean coast to Bir Hakeim. The Axis Army occupied parallel positions. Both armies were preparing to take the offensive, but it was the Axis who struck first. During the night of the 26th and 27th of May, two of Rommel's panzer divisions, a light division and the Italian armour division, began to swing round the southern flank of the British position at Bir Hakeim and drive northeast towards the coast. Although their progress was reported by South African armoured cars, this intelligence was not passed to the 4th Armoured Brigade. The disastrous result was that one of the brigade's regiments was caught deploying. All but 3 of the regiment's grants were lost, although 30 German tanks were knocked out in return. The brigade's 2 remaining regiments began slamming 75mm rounds into the enemy's tanks at a range of 1,200 meters. Shaken by the discovery, the Germans were forced to close the range to make an effective reply and suffered still further losses. Aggressive use of their anti-tank guns, however, began to sap British strength. The 4th Armoured Brigade was left with little choice but to pull back and regroup. As the battle for Gazala raged throughout the afternoon of the 27th of May, 2 brigades from the 1st Armoured Division entered the fray, accompanied by a regiment of Matildas. By evening, Rommel had lost a third of his tanks, and his plan was in ruins. It was a promising start for the grant.
Once the British stop Panzer Army Africa, now is the time to build up and drive them out of Africa altogether. And that's what the British want to do. They cannot allow the Axis to get any closer to Egypt. So what we now have to do is build up, and then when we're ready, punch. What actually happens is that both sides build huge obstacles of minefields and wire, and they sit glowering at each other.
The classic example here is really attritional warfare. El Alamein is one of the first examples of that. The plan really is to grind down your opponent's armour using your minefields and your anti-tank weapons, and only latterly using your own armour, and then allowing your own armour then to go forward on the offensive. The Allies are well aware that the extended supply lines, that the Afrika Korps and the Italians are struggling to maintain those supply lines, and of course the British are still holding out in Malta, and that's also very critical in terms of the supply issue, because the British are able to operate out of Malta and intercept convoys and cause a lot of damage in terms of Rommel getting spare parts, fuel, munitions and other things that he needs.
Over the days that followed, Rommel found himself pinned back against the British minefields. At one stage, he admitted to a captured British officer that unless supplies got through, he would have to offer terms of surrender. Although the British were poised to ambush the vulnerable German army, they just couldn't concentrate the resources to do it. But the Allies paid dearly for this lost opportunity. The Italians managed to carve a path through the minefields, and supplies reached Rommel in the nick of time. When he was ready, he broke out into the open again, defeating the British armoured brigades one by one. On the 20th of June, Rommel took Tobruk, setting the seal on his greatest victory. But at this point, he became a victim of his own success. He made the fatal mistake of pursuing the 8th Army, triggering a series of events that would ultimately lead to his greatest defeat. By July, the Axis army had reached the outskirts of El Alamein. But Rommel found himself in a strategic straitjacket. He lacked the fuel either to continue his advance or retreat. Both armies consolidated their positions behind deep minefields. Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery took over command and set about restoring the morale of the 8th Army.
Montgomery is very important because he comes in and he's a very charismatic military leader we get these speeches where, you know, I've seen you and you've seen me and I like you and you like me, and there was all that kind of thing. And Montgomery was very good at that kind of approach, really. And in terms of him coming in, there was a definite sense, I think, that in the 8th Army that things were going to go much better.
Montgomery imposed orthodoxy, concentration of everything, especially tanks and artillery. They were going to fight together. He instituted a program of training. Anybody who didn't or couldn't fit in with his methods disappeared immediately. He went round the troops. He gave not the slightest hint that Rommel couldn't be defeated. And he acted like a tonic.
Also remember, Montgomery is somebody who is not a tank man per se, and so he's somebody again who believes very much in overwhelming firepower. You know, he's not going to make a move against the Germans and against the Italians until he's sure he's got overwhelming superiority. And that's precisely what he does. He waits until he's got a minimum of a 2-to-1 superiority in any particular area, whether it's air power, artillery, infantry or armour, and then he's prepared to move forward. And of course that policy was remarkably successful. He wins at El Alamein, and the Germans then go on retreat, really, and they don't stop until they get all the way back to Tunisia.
But Montgomery had another problem to deal with. Until July 1942, the Grant was easily the most powerful tank in the desert. But when Rommel had 27 Panzer IVs delivered, shockwaves rippled through the Allied ranks. On paper, the Panzer IV completely outclassed the Grant. Allied crews could only guess as to how it would perform in battle. So the Grant was demoted from desert predator to Egypt's last hope.
Where things start to swing in the Axis favour is with the arrival of the Mark IVs and the Mark IV Specials. Now, the Mark IV is a very good tank. It's better than anything the British have. It's actually better than the Grant.
I don't think the Grants met the Mark IV Special until the Battle of Alam Halfa. It certainly caused us a great deal of surprise. Until then, the Grants had more or less been the dominant tank in the desert for the short period between May 42 and August 42.
From the German point of view, of course, they could never get enough of them to North Africa to really make a difference. So locally they made a difference. They won local battles, but there were never enough of them to win the campaign.
By the end of August, Rommel had accumulated just enough fuel for one last push to the Nile Delta. On the night of the 30th and 31st of August, he began to break through the British minefields on the southern sector of the front. But this took far longer than he'd planned, and he sustained unexpectedly heavy casualties. Once through, he started to head northeast, as he had done at Gazala. Towards evening, this brought him into contact with the 22nd Armoured Brigade, which was positioned on Alam Halfa Ridge. When the Germans turned east towards the position held by an infantry division, a clash became inevitable. When two tank regiments opened fire at close range, the German reaction was immediate. Led by their Mark IVs, their advance was so fierce that a squadron lost all 12 of its Grants within a few minutes. Reinforcements were brought up to plug the gap in the Allied line. Meanwhile, the enemy continued to advance through concentrated artillery fire. They ran into a carefully concealed anti-tank gun position that knocked out several tanks at 100 meters, but did not stop. At this critical moment, with little daylight left, more Allied tanks advanced, making their presence felt at once. The German forces halted, although some of their tanks tried to work round the British flank towards the artillery. The next day, Rommel tried to pass the line of British tanks, but they could not break through. Crippled by an acute lack of fuel, and after sustained aerial bombardments, Rommel was left with little choice but to order a retreat back through the minefields, leaving behind a trail of destruction.
Rommel was a great Boy Scout. He was a charismatic leader of men and a very brave soldier. He didn't always pay as much attention as he should have done to administration and logistics. Now, of course, he knew he was taking a chance. He reckoned that he had just enough fuel to make one go to try and get through the British defences and get to Egypt. He did try, and at Alam Halfa, of course, he fails.
There was no other option for him other than to pull back, shorten his supply lines and go on the defensive. And if he did that, if he had shortened his supply lines and gone in the defensive, it would have handed the initiative to the Allies. And I think he knew that if that happened, the game was up.
By the autumn of 1942, the Grant's successor, the Sherman, started to arrive in the desert. It eventually replaced the Grant as the 8th Army's main battle tank. At the end of October, there were 252 Shermans and 170 Grants in first-line service, plus many more in reserve. At the Second Battle of El Alamein, from the 23rd to the 24th of October 1942, the 8th Army beat the Axis. This victory turned the tide of the war in the desert, but it could so nearly have gone the other way.
Alamein was the last solely British or solely British Empire battle in this war. From now on, all the campaigns are going to be Allied. They're going to be with the Americans. This is our last hurrah, if you like. And it works. But it almost doesn't. When Montgomery decides to tell the armour to break out, he wants the armour to go through cleared lanes in the minefield against a ridge which is lined with German anti-tank guns. And the armour, understandably, finds that very difficult to do, and it's very slow. And Montgomery tells the armoured commanders that they're not doing their job, or they're not getting on, betraying, I'm afraid, a lack of understanding of what armour can do and what armour is supposed to do. He gets away with that, and it's a measure of the man that he learns very quickly how to handle armour from then on. But Alamein wasn't always going to be a surefire winner. There were times when it could have gone wrong.
After being defeated at El Alamein, Rommel salvaged what he could from his shattered army and began the long retreat that would end in the valleys of Tunisia. On the 8th of November, the Anglo-American First Army landed in Morocco and Algeria. Anxious to maintain its presence in North Africa, the Axis began shipping troops into Tunisia, hoping to fend off the First Army's advance from the west and Montgomery's 8th Army from the east. Winter rains held up operations for a while, but in February 1943, the Axis Supreme Command decided that a spoiling attack should be mounted against the inexperienced First Army. Using the sword and shield tactic, the aim was to break through the Kasserine Pass and threaten the Allies' lines of communication, forcing them to withdraw into Morocco.
What was known as the German sword and shield tactic was simply the integration of anti-tank guns with tanks. In very broad terms, what you did was you had a screen of anti-tank guns, dug in, camouflaged. Your enemy is advancing, you halt them with your anti-tank guns, you knock off the leading tanks, everything halts, and then in comes the sword, which is your own armour, German armour, normally attacking from a flank. And that was the standard German tactic. And it took us a long time before we could do something about it.
The 1st U.S. Armored Division, equipped mostly with Lee tanks, guarded the Kasserine Pass. Although the division was keen to get into action, it was completely inexperienced and knew little about the sword and shield tactics used by the panzer divisions. And as repeated attempts were made to break through to American infantry marooned on 3 hills beyond the enemy line, increasingly savage counterattacks did nothing but add to escalating tank losses. When counterattacking along the Spitler-Sidi Bouzid on the 15th of February, part of the 1st Armoured Division ran into a well-concealed anti-tank gun screen and was then itself counterattacked on both flanks, losing 46 tanks and many other vehicles. Although the 1st Armoured Division eventually beat the Axis at Kasserine Pass, victory came at a high price. Hundreds of men lost their lives and many vehicles were destroyed. Harsh lessons were learned about the Lee Grant. Its high silhouette made it a prominent target. If one or both of its fuel tanks were penetrated, the tank would become an inferno in seconds. Events at Kasserine Pass showed the US what damage the Axis was capable of, and the devastating losses hardened up what had been a weak armoured division. It was a turning point for the Lee Grant, which was then promptly replaced by the Sherman as the main Allied battle tank in the Western arena. But the Lee Grant's battle career did not end there. In December 1941, the Japanese 15th Army invaded the British colony of Burma, driving its small Allied force to the Indian border. For the next 4 years, a bitter war raged among the most inhospitable terrain imaginable. Besides its jungle-covered mountain ranges, mangrove swamps and ramshackle roads, Burma was home to deadly insects and diseases which claimed as many men as armed combat. Until early 1944, the Burmese campaign had mainly been fought by infantry. But after much persuasion, General Headquarters in Delhi agreed to send over tanks to help the beleaguered Allied troops. So a number of Lee tanks were dispatched to Burma.
By early 44, we were starting to seriously engage the Japanese again, particularly in the Burma theatre. And one of the things that we desperately needed in Burma was a force multiplier along the lines of a reasonable tank. Now, the Japanese themselves, frankly, their tank design was possibly the weakest of any of the fighting powers in the Second World War. And they didn't field tanks to an enormous degree. So really we didn't have to have a terribly up-to-date fighting tank. But very much like North Africa, we needed something with a decent high explosive shell that could take on infantry, and something that was very, very reliable.
From now on, it is the Allies in Burma that are going to be advancing rather than the Japanese. The Grant is useful because Japanese tanks were appalling. We criticize British tank development. Japanese are far worse. Perfectly understandably, because the only enemy they had to worry about, or they thought they had to worry about, were the Chinese, who didn't have any tanks at all. But it did mean that, of course, the Grant was way ahead of anything the Japanese could produce.
So, safe in the knowledge that they would not be faced with opponents like the German Panzer IV or Tiger tanks, Lee crews did not expect armoured clashes anything like those of the Desert Campaign. But they had underestimated the courage of Japanese tank crews, who, despite having much weaker tanks, were still determined to make life hell for the Allies. On the 20th of March 1944, 6 Japanese light tanks tried to ambush a column escorted by 2 troops of Lee's. The Japanese commander had positioned his tanks close to the left side of the track, so the Lee's 75mm or 37mm guns could not be used. One Allied tank was set ablaze, but the rest roared past into a clearing where they swung round to confront their foes. After a brief but intense firefight, the Japanese made a run for it. 5 were set ablaze and the 6th was knocked out. The message was clear. The Japanese did not consider the Lee as a threat. The episode provided a glimpse of things to come.
The Japanese had all kinds of methods of engaging tanks. They could use manpower to do all kinds of things, and they would engage tanks very, very closely and use satchel charges, which are explosives in an ordinary bag, if you like, placed on top of a tank hatch in particular. The hatches were recognised as being particularly vulnerable. You had suicide squads with a large aircraft bomb, somebody sitting in a foxhole with a hammer, waiting for a tank to drive over the top. He would strike the fuse on the bomb, and the bomb would explode and take the tank with it. So yes, the Japanese, although they didn't have the technology and they really didn't have very effective anti-tank weapons, they made up for it in tenacity and a willingness to take enormous casualties.
The most unutterable disgrace for the Japanese soldier was to be taken alive, even if he was wounded. He could not go home. Consequently, he fought to the last in bunkers. Everywhere he would launch suicidal attacks, one after the other, over the same ground and so on. He used every means in his power to destroy the enemy. And if a tank represented a particular threat to him, he would do everything in his power to destroy that.
Despite the inferiority of Japanese tanks and anti-tank guns, Allied soldiers still faced a terrifying menace. The suicidal bravery of individual Japanese soldiers meant that men were willing to take on tanks using their wits and bare hands. So as a defense against hand-placed explosive charges, a thick wire grille was fitted above the Lee's engine deck. Another weapon the Japanese used during the Burma campaign was to smash grenades filled with cyanide gas against a tank's vision hatch to poison the crew inside. On one occasion, a sword-wielding Japanese officer even scrambled into a Lee, killing the commander and 37mm gunner. It took all 6 rounds of the loader's revolver to finally kill him. By 1944, Japanese anti-tank strategies and weapons had reached another, more sinister level. The end of the Burma campaign saw the appearance of the anti-tank equivalent of the kamikaze, the Nokohaku Kogegi, otherwise known as human combat tank destruction squads. These volunteers would suddenly break cover and throw themselves under a tank, where they would detonate the explosive charge strapped to their bodies. This need for extra vigilance triggered the formation of specialist infantry support units who were trained to repel such attacks.
We had now become quite used to these suicidal tactics they employed, and we had trained a regiment called the Bombay Grenadiers in close support for tank. 9 times out of 10 they shot these guys when they emerged from cover. It was a very dangerous job being a close escort, but they were good at it. Again, tank crews got used to it themselves. Those occasions I've known where they've simply reversed off the man who was thrown them, and he's blown himself up, in front of them, and so on. They were desperate measures, and they didn't work.
There are many cases, where you have mass infantry assaults against armour, and there's only going to be one result in that, and that's going to be mass casualties for the Japanese. So this is an important tank. It has a very important psychological effect, I think, on the Japanese, and it has a critical role in the battles around Imphal and the drive south through Malaysia. So all in all, the Grant tank, which had performed well in the Western Desert, also has a critical role out here in the Far East in the latter part of World War II.
The Japanese were experts in constructing bunkers, which were concealed with vegetation and connected by underground galleries. But once detected, no bunker complex was safe from the Lee. The vegetation was blasted off with high explosive until a fire slit was revealed. Whenever possible, a smoke round was put into the slit. Seeping along the galleries, the smoke would reveal more and more fire slits. The timbers would then be smashed up with more armour-piercing shot until the roof collapsed. If necessary, stubborn bunkers would be blasted apart with high explosive. In February 1944, the Lee played a vital part in the defence of the 7th Indian Division's admin box in northern Burma, after it was attacked by the Japanese 55th Division. The tank's tremendous firepower smashed up the enemy's attacks, destroyed its bunkers, and provided defensive chutes at night. In one notorious incident, the Japanese captured the main dressing station, slaughtering patients and orderlies alike. After this atrocity, neither British nor Indian troops were willing to show the Japanese any mercy.
Now, the admin box was basically 1,200 yards, or about 1,000 metres, of open paddy fields that were surrounded by jungle. And so what we have there is this very brutal battle of the admin box with dug-in British troops from the 7th Indian Division, but supported by the Grant tank. And the Japanese really had no answer to this. And the tank and its firepower were very critical in that battle of the admin box, and really actually saved Britain's military reputation in this battle in part because the British forces had been surprised. They hadn't expected the Japanese to show up and be prepared to assault what was their supply centre and administrative centre. And so the fighting around this area was incredibly ferocious. But the tank really had a major impact in terms of this.
In March 1944, the Japanese launched Operation U-Go, an attack on the eastern Indian region of Assam. The aim was to inspire the Indian people to revolt against their British rulers and so divert American forces from the war in the Pacific. The British 4th Corps found itself besieged by the Japanese 15th Army on the Imphal Plain, as was the small garrison at Kohima, lying on the main route back to India. At Imphal, the Lees helped to recapture the towering peak of Nunshigum, which dominated the main airfield, and also flushed out the Japanese from surrounding villages. On the 18th of April, the Lees of the British 33rd Corps relieved Kohima, and then fought their way south to relieve 4 Corps at Imphal on the 22nd of June. The Allies captured Mandalay on the 20th of March 1945, after a diversionary attack was mounted at the vital enemy communications centre of Maiktila. Starved of supplies and ammunition, the Japanese divisions holding the Irrawaddy line simply disintegrated. This triggered what became known as the Race for Rangoon, in which 4 Corps travelled down the Maiktila to Rangoon railway corridor, while 33 Corps followed the more difficult line of the Irrawaddy. Rangoon was rapidly abandoned by the enemy, and the war in Burma was over.
In Burma, it really came into its own. It could have been designed for war in a semi-jungle environment. And I cannot think of a tank which could have performed better in those circumstances. Later it played a useful role in a variety of tasks, special purpose vehicles and that sort of thing. So it was a success story within the limitations of the period in which it served.
As a tank, it worked extremely well in this terrain. It certainly surprised the Japanese. The Japanese really had no effective answer to this deployment of this tank. And as I say, their own tank design was not going to be sufficient to actually challenge the M3 Grant at all, really, in Malaysia.
The Lee Grant was only ever meant to be a stopgap, yet it enjoyed a wartime career that stretched from the Sahara to the jungles of Burma. Although it was overshadowed in the west by the arrival of the M4 Sherman, it proved perfectly suited to Burma's treacherous terrain and climate. Its reliability and speed earned it the respect of crews and the fear of opponents. And until 1945, it was America's answer to the Axis menace.